I'm sitting here in my burgundy sweater in spring, and I'm finally sorting through all those envelopes I've been ignoring for months. Some still have the plastic windows showing the amount due. Others are just letters from people I haven't talked to in years. The mail keeps piling up on my kitchen table like an accusation, and I'm supposed to pretend it doesn't mean anything. But it does. Everything means something when you're 71 years old and you've just realized your entire life was a lie. Let me back up. I need to tell you something I never thought I'd actually say out loud, even though it happened when I was 55. I've kept this quiet for so long, but I think if I don't tell it now, someone else will suffer the same way I did. And maybe if you're listening and you recognize yourself in this story, you'll know you're not alone. You're not crazy, and you don't deserve what happened to you. When he threw those divorce papers at me that afternoon, I was standing by the stove. There was a pot of collard greens simmering low, the way my mother taught me, the way I've made them every Sunday for decades. He came home early from work, walked into the kitchen like he owned the place, which I guess in his mind he did, and he just threw them, like they were nothing, like I was nothing. And then he said it. I'm taking everything. I remember the words landing on me like a weight I couldn't lift off my chest. But here's the thing nobody expects to hear. I smiled, not because I was happy. God, no. I smiled because something in me broke open right then, and underneath all that breaking was a sound, like ice cracking in spring, like something thawing out that had been frozen for way too long. He didn't understand the smile. He thought I was being naive. Stupid, probably. That's what he always told me, that I was stupid for believing him, stupid for thinking my sacrifices meant anything, stupid for staying. For years he told me our marriage was fine, that I was imagining the problems, that if I was unhappy it was because I wasn't grateful enough. I gave up so much to make him happy. My inheritance from my mother, that went into his business. The down payment we'd saved for the house we wanted, gone to cover his debts. Even my mother's Singer sewing machine, the one she left to me, he wanted to sell. I fought him on that one at least. I kept it in the bedroom, hidden almost, because it was the last thing I had that was really mine. I believed that if I just gave enough, sacrificed enough, stayed quiet enough, eventually he would love me the way I loved him. That's what I told myself. That's what I kept telling myself, even when my chest would tighten up at the sound of his car in the driveway, even when I started checking my words before I said them, even when I couldn't remember the last time I laughed without asking permission first. The collard greens kept simmering while he stood there, waiting for me to cry or argue or beg him to stay. My choir robe was hanging in the closet upstairs, pressed and ready for Sunday service. I'd been in that choir for 30 years, and that community was the only place I could still breathe, the only place where I felt like I was still real. If this story sounds familiar, if you felt what I'm describing, could you do me a favor? Just hit that like button so this reaches someone else who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because these stories need to be told, and maybe yours is next. Maybe you're the one someone else is waiting to hear from. Our row house in Queens isn't much to look at from the outside. 2 stories, narrow backyard with a clothesline that squeaks every time the wind picks up. The public housing complex courtyard out front is where kids play handball against the brick walls, where old men sit on benches arguing about baseball and politics. I used to watch them from my kitchen window while I was doing dishes, and I'd think about how easy their lives looked, how simple. Just sitting there, talking about nothing that mattered, nothing that could hurt them. My burgundy sweater was a gift from my daughter 10 years ago, back when she still believed her father was a good man. Back when she'd say things like, "You're lucky to have someone who works so hard for the family." I wore it so much the elbows started to thin, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. It was the only thing in my closet that felt like it belonged to me, not to the version of me he wanted. Spring was coming finally. The windows had been shut tight all winter, keeping out the cold, but also keeping in all the silence, all the things I couldn't say. Now the air was different, lighter. I could smell flowers from someone's garden down the block, mixing with exhaust from the buses on the main road. Everything was opening up, and I was sitting there with mail I couldn't face, wearing a sweater that was falling apart, wondering how I'd gotten here. The Singer's sewing machine sat in the corner of my bedroom upstairs, covered with a cloth to keep the dust off. My mother used to make everything on that machine. Our church dresses, my father's work shirts, quilts that we'd wrap ourselves in during winter. When she died, it was the one thing I asked for. Not the jewelry, not the dishes, just that machine. Because it meant something. It meant her hands had touched it, her foot had worked the pedal, her eyes had guided fabric through those needles with such precision and care. He wanted to sell it 3 years into our marriage. Said it was taking up space, said I never used it anyway, said we needed the money for his business expansion. I told him no. It was the first time I'd ever told him no about anything, and he looked at me like I'd slapped him. He didn't speak to me for a week, and I learned. Saying no costs too much. Saying no means silence, means anger, means walking on eggshells until you apologize for having boundaries. So I stopped saying no. I said yes to giving up my inheritance. $20,000 my mother had saved her whole life, dollar by dollar, cleaning houses and taking in laundry. Yes to letting him handle all our finances, even though his name was the only one on the accounts. Yes to canceling plans with friends because he needed me home. Yes to missing my daughter's school events because he had work dinners I needed to attend. Yes to pretending I didn't notice when he'd come home late smelling like perfume that wasn't mine. Yes to acting like I was fine when I was dissolving from the inside out. I used to write letters. That was my hobby. Back before everything else took over. I'd sit at the kitchen table with good paper and a pen, and I'd write to my cousin in Virginia, to my old friend from college who moved to California, to women I'd met at church conventions over the years. Real letters, the kind you fold carefully and put in envelopes, the kind that require stamps and patience and attention. I loved it. Loved the ritual of it, the way handwriting slows you down, makes you think about what you want to say. He hated it, called it a waste of time, said I should be doing something productive instead of gossiping with people I barely knew anymore. So I stopped. Packed away the nice stationery, threw out the stamps, told myself it was childish anyway. That grown women with responsibilities didn't have time for hobbies. That sacrifice meant giving up the small joys so the bigger ones could survive. Except the bigger joys never came. I kept waiting for them, kept thinking if I just held on a little longer, gave a little more, loved a little harder, we'd get to the part where it was worth it. Where he'd look at me and see everything I'd done and say thank you. Where my kids would understand that I'd stayed for them, that I'd given up pieces of myself so they could have a stable home. But stability built on quicksand isn't stability at all. It's just slow sinking, so gradual you don't notice until you're already under. The collard greens on the stove that day were supposed to be for Sunday dinner. I was planning the whole meal in my head. Cornbread, mac and cheese, fried chicken, sweet tea. His favorite meal. Our kids were coming over with the grandchildren, and I wanted everything to be perfect because maybe, just maybe, if the food was good enough and the house was clean enough and I smiled enough, we could all pretend we were still a family that worked. I remember thinking, as I stood there with those papers at my feet and that pot still bubbling, how many collard greens I'd made in my life. How many Sundays I'd spent in that kitchen, cooking for people who barely looked up from their plates to acknowledge the work. How many times I'd served him first, made sure his portion was the best, asked if he needed anything else while my own plate sat getting cold. The smell of those greens filled the whole house, bitter and earthy and somehow comforting despite everything. My mother used to say you could tell the state of a woman's heart by how she cooked her greens. If they were tough and bland, she was holding back. If they were tender and rich with flavor, she was pouring love into that pot, even if nobody deserved it. Mine were always tender, always rich, always made with more love than anyone bothered to notice. That's when I realized I'd been making myself tender for people who preferred me tough enough to use and soft enough to ignore. I'd been seasoning my life with what everyone else wanted, and somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten what I tasted like without all that accommodation. So when he said he was taking everything, when he stood there in my kitchen with that look on his face like he'd won something, I smiled. Because suddenly I understood. He couldn't take what I'd already lost. He couldn't steal what I'd already given away. And whatever was left, whatever small piece of me was still mine, that was more valuable than anything he could touch. My choir robe hung upstairs, waiting for Sunday. Navy blue with gold trim, pressed so carefully you could see your reflection in the fabric. I'd been singing in that choir since before we got married, back when I was still the kind of person who believed her voice mattered. Church was the only place I could still be loud, the only place where crying was expected, where joy was encouraged, where you could raise your hands and nobody told you to calm down or act right. The women in that choir knew things about me I'd never said out loud. They could read the exhaustion in my shoulders, the forced brightness in my smile, the way I'd slip out early if he texted that he needed me home. They'd pray for me without asking questions, slip their phone numbers into my hand with a squeeze that meant call me when you're ready. They knew. They all knew, and they were waiting for me to know it too. But knowing and accepting are two different countries, and I'd been living in denial so long I'd forgotten what truth looked like. I'd forgotten that normal marriages don't require you to rehearse conversations in your head before you have them. Normal love doesn't make you smaller. Normal partnership doesn't mean one person does all the bending while the other stays rigid as steel. He'd been shaping my reality for so long that his version of events felt more real than my own memories. When I'd bring up something hurtful he'd said, he'd tell me I was remembering wrong, that I was too sensitive, that I was making things up to start drama. When I'd mention feeling lonely, he'd list everything he provided, the roof over my head, the food in my mouth, the bills he paid, as if money could fill the empty space where partnership should have been. And I believed him. That's the part that haunts me most. I believed that my feelings were the problem, that my expectations were too high, that if I was a better wife, I wouldn't feel this persistent ache in my chest. I believed that marriage meant sacrifice, and sacrifice meant silence, and silence meant safety. But silence doesn't keep you safe. It just keeps you quiet while everything inside you dies. The mail on my table that spring afternoon wasn't just bills and junk. There were letters I'd written but never sent, tucked into envelopes I'd addressed years ago to friends who drifted away because I'd canceled too many plans, made too many excuses, chosen him over them too many times. There were bank statements from accounts I wasn't allowed to access, property documents for a house that had my name on the deed but his control in every room. There were medical bills from when I'd gotten sick the year before, and he'd told me to handle it myself because he was too busy with work. I'd been avoiding that pile because looking at it meant acknowledging how much I'd let slip through my fingers, how much I'd surrendered without even a fight, how completely I'd trusted someone who saw my trust as weakness to exploit. That Singer sewing machine upstairs, I'd walk past it sometimes and remember my mother sitting at one just like it, her back straight, her hands steady, creating things from nothing but fabric and thread and vision. She'd made beauty, made usefulness, made something that lasted. What had I made? What did I have to show for 36 years of marriage besides exhaustion and a smile that felt like a mask I couldn't take off? Spring air came through the window, carrying sounds of kids playing in the courtyard, of buses hissing to stops, of life continuing outside my kitchen while inside everything was ending. And I stood there in my burgundy sweater, my mother's pot of greens still simmering, my husband's words still echoing, I'm taking everything, and I smiled. Because I finally understood. When you have nothing left, nobody can take anything from you. When you've already been hollowed out, there's nothing left to hollow. And in that emptiness, in that space where all my sacrifice and silence and small deaths had accumulated, something new was trying to grow. something that looked a lot like rage. And underneath the rage, something even more dangerous, self-respect. Everything changed about 6 months after he left. I'd been managing, barely. Staying in that house with all its memories, all its ghosts, all its evidence of who I used to be. My daughter would call and I'd lie about being fine. My son would visit and I'd perform normalcy, make his favorite foods, ask about work, pretend my life hadn't just exploded into pieces I couldn't fit back together. Then my body decided to tell the truth my mouth wouldn't say. I collapsed at church one Sunday, right there in the choir loft. 1 minute I was singing about grace and mercy, the next I was on the floor, my choir robe tangled around my legs, my voice gone silent in a way that felt prophetic. Heart problems, the doctor said. Stress-induced. Your body's been in fight or flight mode for so long it forgot how to rest. You need to stay with someone for a while. Somewhere you feel safe. Somewhere you can actually heal. So I went to my daughter's place. She set me up in her guest room, brought me tea, sat with me while I cried for the first time in months. And one afternoon when she was at work, I started going through some boxes she'd been storing for me. Things from before the marriage, things I'd packed away and forgotten existed. That's when I found the photographs. Me at 23, arms around friends at someone's wedding. My smile was enormous, unguarded. The kind of smile that comes from a body that doesn't know yet about checking itself, measuring itself, shrinking itself to fit someone else's comfort. I was wearing a yellow dress, and my hair was natural, big and free, and I looked so certain of my place in the world. Me at 28, graduation from my nursing program. I'd worked so hard for that degree, night classes while working full-time, studying at kitchen tables and on bus rides, believing I was building something. I never worked as a nurse after we got married. He said we didn't need the money, that it would be too stressful, that I should focus on taking care of home. I said okay. I always said okay. Me at 31, holding my son when he was just born. The exhaustion in my eyes was real, but so was the joy. This pure, uncomplicated joy that came from creating life, from being someone's whole world. I remembered that version of me. She was tired, but she was still fighting. Still believing things could be good if she just tried hard enough. Then the photos stopped, or rather, I stopped appearing in them the same way. The later pictures showed me in backgrounds, partially cut off, or with smiles that didn't reach my eyes. In family photos, I was always positioned slightly behind, slightly to the side, like I was apologizing for taking up space even in a frame. I sat on my daughter's guest bed with these photographs spread around me like evidence, and I asked myself the question I'd been avoiding for decades. When did I disappear? When did I become this small? The answer was so obvious it hurt. Slowly, gradually. One yes at a time, one sacrifice at a time, one moment of choosing peace over truth, quiet over self-respect, his comfort over my dignity. I'd been erasing myself in increments so tiny I didn't notice until I was basically a ghost, walking through my own life, haunting the spaces where I used to exist. My daughter came home and found me like that, surrounded by evidence of who I used to be. She sat next to me and said the thing I needed to hear. Mom, you're still in there. That woman in those photos, she didn't die. She's just been waiting for you to remember her. But remembering was the problem. Because once I remembered who I was before I learned to be small, I couldn't unknow it. Couldn't unsee the years of systematic erasure, the way he'd trained me to doubt my own memories, my own perceptions, my own worth. The way he'd convinced me that love meant giving until you had nothing left, and then giving some more, just to prove you were committed. Gaslighting is a word I didn't know back then, but it's the perfect description for what he did, making me question reality itself. When I'd say he promised to do something, he'd swear he never said it. When I'd express hurt over something he did, he'd tell me I was too sensitive, that I was making mountains out of molehills, that I needed to learn to take a joke. When I'd point out financial decisions he'd made without consulting me, he'd say I'd agreed to it, that I must have forgotten, that my memory was getting bad, and I believed him. I started writing things down to keep track, but then I'd doubt my own notes. Started recording conversations in my head, but then I'd wonder if I was remembering them right. My reality became so unreliable, I stopped trusting anything, especially myself. That's when the physical symptoms started. The heart palpitations, the insomnia, the weight loss, the constant low-level anxiety that made my hands shake and my chest tight. My body was trying to tell me what my mind refused to acknowledge. This isn't love. This is abuse dressed up as marriage. This is systematic destruction packaged as partnership. The health crisis forced me to stop moving long enough to listen, and what I heard terrified me. I'm disappearing. I'm being erased. If I don't do something now, there won't be enough of me left to save. My daughter pulled out more boxes. We found old journals where I'd written about dreams I'd had, opening my own seamstress business, taking a trip to the beach, learning to paint, going back to school. Dreams I'd filed away under someday, under when things settle down, under when he's in a better mood, under when the kids are older, under when we have more money. Under every excuse I could manufacture to avoid admitting the truth. He didn't want me to have dreams. He wanted me to be available, manageable, and small enough to fit inside his idea of what a wife should be. There was a letter I'd written to myself on my 40th birthday. I'd forgotten about it completely. In it, I talked about feeling invisible, about wondering if this was all there was, about a persistent sadness I couldn't shake. But then the last paragraph said something that broke me open. I know I deserve better than this. I know love isn't supposed to hurt this much, but I'm scared that if I leave, I'll have wasted all these years for nothing. At least if I stay, the sacrifice means something. I read that letter to my daughter through tears, and she looked at me with such sadness and said, "Mom, staying didn't make the sacrifice meaningful. It just made the waste bigger." She was right. Every additional year I stayed wasn't honoring the time I'd already given. It was throwing good years after bad, compounding the loss, making the hole deeper. I'd been operating under this logic that sunk costs justified further investment, that if I'd already given so much, I had to keep giving or admit it was all for nothing. But here's what I finally understood. There in that guest room, surrounded by photos of who I used to be, it was already for nothing. The sacrifice had already been meaningless. The only question was whether I'd keep sacrificing or start saving what was left. That photo of me at 23, smiling in my yellow dress, became my collapse point. Because I saw her, really saw her, and I realized she trusted me to protect her. She walked into that marriage believing I'd keep her safe, keep her whole, keep her voice loud, and her dreams alive. And I'd failed her. I'd let her be diminished, dismissed, and destroyed piece by piece until she was barely recognizable. I cried for days. Not the quiet, controlled tears I'd learned to cry where nobody could see. These were loud, body-shaking sobs that came from somewhere so deep I didn't know it existed. I cried for the woman I used to be. I cried for the woman I could have become. I cried for all the years I'd spent being someone I didn't even recognize anymore. And then I got angry. Not the kind of anger that burns out quick, the kind that settles into your bones and changes your architecture, the kind that says no more, the kind that draws lines and holds them, the kind that stops apologizing for existing. I started making phone calls. To a lawyer first, then to the bank, then to friends I'd lost touch with, then to my sister-in-law, who I'd barely spoken to in years because he'd convinced me she didn't like me, that she was jealous, that she was trying to cause problems in our marriage. Turns out, she'd been waiting for my call. She'd seen what he was doing. She'd tried to say something years ago, and he'd cut her off completely. Told everyone she was bitter about her own divorce and projecting. but she'd been keeping notes, documentation, evidence of things he'd said and done, ways he'd manipulated family events, money that had gone missing from family accounts. She said, "I've been waiting for you to be ready. I knew you'd figure it out eventually. I just hoped it wouldn't take this long." We sat on my daughter's porch, and she told me things I'd blocked out, things I'd explained away, things I'd minimized because accepting them would have meant accepting that I'd married someone who saw me as property, not a partner. She told me about the time he'd bragged at a family dinner about how easy I was to manage, how I'd believe anything if you said it with enough confidence. She told me about money he'd borrowed from his mother and never paid back, always blaming our expenses, my spending, my inability to budget properly. She told me I wasn't the first. There'd been a woman before me, a girlfriend he'd had before we met, who'd left him after 2 years because of how he twisted her reality, made her doubt herself, isolated her from friends. I'd never known. He'd told me she was crazy, that she'd cheated on him, that he'd had to end it for his own mental health. Every revelation was another brick in the wall I was building between who I'd been and who I was becoming. Every piece of truth was another thread I could follow back to myself. My sister-in-law said something I'll never forget. "You know what the cruelest part is. He convinced you that your love was the problem, that if you just loved him better, more patiently, more selflessly, everything would work out. But the truth is, the more you loved him, the more material he had to work with. Your love was never the problem. His character was." That's when I understood the full scope of what had happened. It wasn't that I'd loved wrong or sacrificed poorly or failed at being a good wife. It was that I'd been in a relationship with someone who saw my devotion as opportunity, my loyalty as weakness, my commitment as something to exploit. And the family who was supposed to protect me, they'd watched it happen. Some actively participated, echoing his version of events, treating me like I was dramatic or difficult when I tried to speak up. Others stayed silent, which was its own kind of betrayal. Nobody said, "This isn't okay." Nobody said, "You deserve better than this." Nobody said, "We see what he's doing and we're on your side." Except my sister-in-law and my daughter. And slowly, a few others who'd been watching from the margins, waiting for permission to speak truth. We started meeting regularly, this small group of women who'd been touched by his manipulation in different ways. We compared notes. We filled in each other's gaps. We stopped letting him control the narrative. And I realized I wasn't alone. I'd never been alone. I'd just been isolated so thoroughly I couldn't see the people who were trying to reach me. That's when I started planning my next move. Not revenge, I was past that, but liberation, real, concrete, permanent liberation. I started with the calendar, that stupid color-coded calendar I'd kept for 36 years, marking his appointments, his preferences, his needs. Red for work events I needed to attend, blue for family obligations, green for his personal time that I was supposed to protect. My own needs didn't even make it onto the calendar. They existed in the margins, in the maybe if there's time category, which there never was. I took that calendar down from the kitchen wall, held it for a moment, feeling the weight of all those years of scheduling my life around his. Then I walked to the trash and threw it away. Didn't save it for reference, didn't keep it just in case. Just dropped it in and walked away. My daughter watched me do it and said, "Mom, are you okay?" I said, "I am now." I spent the next 3 months doing things I'd convinced myself I was too busy for. I called my old friend in California and we talked for 2 hours about nothing important, just catching up, just being. I went to lunch with my neighbor from the complex, a woman named Patricia who'd lived 2 doors down for a decade and who I'd barely spoken to beyond pleasantries because I was always rushing, always busy, always on my way to serve someone else's needs. Patricia and I sat in a diner in Queens, and she told me about her own marriage, her own escape, She'd left 15 years ago after her husband tried to convince her she was losing her mind, that she was forgetting conversations they'd had, that she was becoming a danger to herself. Turns out he'd been drugging her coffee, small amounts, just enough to make her foggy and confused. She said, "The thing nobody tells you is that leaving is just the beginning. The real work is learning to trust yourself again, learning that your perceptions are valid, your feelings matter, your needs are legitimate. That takes years. But I had years now. I had time that belonged to me. I had days that didn't require me to perform or produce or prove my worth through service. I started going back to church, really going, not just showing up physically while my mind was somewhere else making grocery lists and planning meals. I sat in that choir loft, and I sang like I meant it, like the words were for me too, like I was allowed to receive grace, not just give it. The women in the choir embraced me differently now. Before, they'd been gentle, careful, like I might break. Now they treated me like I was becoming something stronger, something that could bear witness to its own resurrection. Sister Margaret, who'd been in the choir longer than anyone, pulled me aside one Sunday and said, "We've been praying for you. Not that you'd stay, but that you'd leave. We've been praying you'd remember who you are before he convinced you to forget." I went to a lawyer with my sister-in-law. We brought all the documentation she'd been keeping, plus what I'd managed to gather about our finances, our property, the inheritance money he'd taken. The lawyer looked at everything and said, "This is financial abuse. This is exploitation of marital assets. You have a case." But here's what I learned. Having a case and winning a case are two different things. He had resources I didn't have. He had time and money and a willingness to drag things out indefinitely. He had a family who believed his version, who saw me as the problem, who would testify that I was difficult, ungrateful, mentally unstable. The lawyer said, "I'm going to be honest with you. You might not get back what he took. The courts are slow and family tends to circle the wagons, but you can protect what's left. You can make sure he can't take anything else." So that's what I did. I opened my own bank account, just mine, with only my name. I rerouted my Social Security checks. I started learning about credit scores and asset protection and how to build financial independence when you're starting from almost nothing at 56 years old. It was terrifying. I'd never handled money on my own. He'd always managed everything, and I'd let him because it felt like that was his role, his responsibility, his domain. But giving him that power had been giving him the key to my cage. Patricia helped me understand the basics. She took me to the bank, showed me how to read statements, explained interest rates and fees, and how to spot predatory lending. She said, "Money isn't scary. Not knowing about money is scary. Not having control over money is scary. Money itself is just a tool, and you're about to learn how to use it." I started small. Put $20 in savings every week from my Social Security. Watched it add up, this tiny pile of safety I was building for myself. It felt like planting seeds in ground I'd thought was dead. It felt like proof I could still grow something. I threw away the calendar of obligations in October, 6 months after the divorce papers landed at my feet. It was a Tuesday. Nothing special about the day except that I woke up and decided I was done organizing my life around anyone else's schedule. I stood in my daughter's kitchen, I was still living with her then, and I held that calendar and I felt something shift. My daughter said, "You okay, Mom?" I said, "I'm free." She hugged me and we both cried, but they were different tears than before. Not lost tears, liberation tears. The kind that come when you finally let go of something that was never yours to carry in the first place. I started making plans, small ones at first. Lunch with a friend on a Wednesday afternoon, just because. A trip to the library to get a card. I hadn't had a library card in 20 years because he said it was a waste when you could buy books. A pottery class at the community center that met on Thursday evenings. Then bigger plans. I started looking at apartments. Small places, one-bedrooms in neighborhoods I'd never considered because they weren't close to his work or convenient for his commute. places that were mine to choose based on what I wanted. Good light, a small balcony, close to the bus line so I could get around easily. Patricia went with me to look at places. We'd stand in empty apartments, and I'd try to imagine my life there, try to picture myself in these spaces without the weight of his presence, his opinions, his constant judgment. It felt impossible at first, like trying to imagine breathing underwater. But slowly, room by room, I started to see it. Started to believe I could actually exist on my own terms. I found a place in February, almost a year after he'd thrown those papers at me. It was small, a one-bedroom in a building full of other older women, mostly widows and divorcees who decided they were done living for anyone else. The landlord was a woman in her 60s who'd bought the building after her own divorce. She said, "I only rent to women who are starting over. We look out for each other here." The apartment had a window in the living room that got afternoon sun. It had a little kitchenette, just big enough for one person to cook without feeling crowded. It had a bedroom barely bigger than a closet, but it was mine. All mine. I signed the lease with my own name, just mine. No co-signers, no husband's approval, no permission needed from anyone. The landlord handed me the keys and said, "Welcome home." I moved my mother's Singer sewing machine in first, set it up by the window where the light was good. Then I brought my choir robe, my photographs, my small collection of books I'd managed to save. Everything else I bought new, second-hand mostly, from thrift stores and estate sales, but new to me. A bed that nobody else had slept in. Dishes that didn't come with memories of meals eaten in silence. A small couch where I could sit and read without wondering when he'd come home and what mood he'd be in. The first night in that apartment, I made myself dinner. Just me. Collard greens, because I wanted them, because they reminded me of my mother, because I was allowed to take up space with smells that made me happy. I sat at my tiny kitchen table, a folding card table I'd bought for $12, and I ate slowly, tasting every bite, not rushing, not serving anyone else first. And I cried. Happy tears this time. Relief tears. I made it tears. Patricia came by the next day to help me unpack. We hung curtains and arranged furniture and talked about what it meant to live alone after decades of living for someone else. She said, "The hardest part is learning you don't have to ask permission anymore. You'll catch yourself doing it, asking invisible people if it's okay to buy yourself something nice, if it's okay to rest, if it's okay to take up space. It takes time to unlearn that." She was right. I'd catch myself about to apologize to an empty room for making noise. I'd hesitate before buying groceries I actually wanted, hearing his voice in my head telling me I was being wasteful, indulgent, selfish. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with my heart racing, convinced I'd forgotten to do something important for someone who no longer lived with me. But slowly, those voices got quieter. The apartment started feeling like mine. I established routines that were just for me. Saturday morning library visits, Sunday afternoon choir practice, Tuesday evening pottery class. I started writing letters again, pulling out that old stationery I'd saved, reconnecting with friends I'd lost touch with. One woman wrote back saying she'd wondered what happened to me, that she'd tried to keep in touch, but I'd stopped responding to her calls and letters years ago. She said she understood now, that she'd been through something similar, that she was glad I'd found my way back. Finding my way back, that's exactly what it felt like. Like I'd been lost in a dark forest for decades, and I was finally seeing light through the trees, finally remembering which direction was home. The liberation symbol, throwing away that calendar, seemed small at the time. But it opened something in me. This understanding that I could choose differently, that I didn't have to keep living by someone else's schedule, someone else's priorities, someone else's definition of what my life should look like. I started dreaming about the beach. Not just thinking about it vaguely, but actual planning. I'd lie in bed in my little apartment and imagine what it would be like to live somewhere where I could hear waves, where the air smelled like salt, where I could walk on sand every morning if I wanted to. Patricia said, "So why don't you?" I said, "I'm 57 years old. I can't just move to a beach town. That's not realistic." She said, "Why not? Who's going to stop you?" And I realized nobody. Nobody was going to stop me. The only person standing in my way was me, and I was done doing that. I started researching small beach towns within my budget, places where rent was cheaper than Queens, where the pace was slower, where nobody knew my story and I could just be whoever I decided to be. I found a few possibilities: little coastal communities in the Carolinas, in Florida, in Delaware. Places where old women went to retire and start over. I wasn't ready to move yet. I needed to build up more savings, needed to make sure I could support myself, needed to finish some legal things that were still pending. But having the dream, having the plan, having something to work toward, that changed everything. It gave me a reason to keep protecting my money, keep building my independence, keep choosing myself even when it was hard. The first time I slept through the entire night without waking up anxious was 3 months after I moved into my apartment. I woke up at dawn to light coming through my curtains, and I lay there for a minute, confused about why I felt so rested, so peaceful. Then I realized I'd slept, really slept. My body had finally decided it was safe enough to rest. I cried again. I was doing a lot of that, crying at weird times for reasons I couldn't always explain. But these tears felt different. They felt like release. Like my body was letting go of decades of held tension, decades of bracing for impact, decades of never quite feeling safe in my own home. I got up and made coffee, just for me, just the way I liked it, strong and dark with a little honey. I sat by my window and watched the sun come up over the buildings across the street. I thought about my mother, about what she would say if she could see me now. I think she'd be proud. I think she'd say it's about time. I think she'd tell me that the Singer sewing machine was always meant to be mine, that she'd known someday I'd need it as proof that I came from women who made things, who built things, who created beauty even when life was hard. I pulled out that machine that morning and I started sewing. Nothing fancy, just fixing a hem on a dress I'd bought secondhand. But using my hands that way, working with fabric and thread, following the rhythm of the machine, it felt like coming home to a part of myself I'd abandoned. It felt like reclaiming something precious. Patricia stopped by later that day and found me still sewing, surrounded by fabric scraps and pins. She said, "Look at you, you're glowing." I said, "I'm just fixing a hem." She said, "No, you're fixing yourself." And it shows. That night I called my daughter and told her I was thinking about moving to the beach eventually, when the time was right. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom, I think that's perfect. I think you should do exactly what makes you happy for once." I said, "What about you? What if you need me?" She said, "Mom, I'm 35 years old. I'll be fine, and you'll be a phone call away. Plus, I'll have an excuse to visit the beach." We laughed and I realized I'd been holding myself back with imaginary obligations, with what-ifs and maybes, with the belief that I was required to be perpetually available for everyone else's needs. But my daughter didn't need me to sacrifice myself for her. She needed me to show her what it looked like to choose yourself, to build a life on your own terms, to refuse to settle for less than you deserve. I was teaching her something by leaving. I was showing her that it's never too late to start over, that you don't have to accept abuse just because time has passed, that your life belongs to you no matter how long you've let someone else control it. That lesson was worth more than any amount of proximity or availability or traditional family structure. That lesson was the gift I wished someone had given me at her age. I kept working, kept saving, kept planning. I got stronger physically. All that walking around Queens, running errands on foot instead of asking for rides, carrying my own groceries up 3 flights of stairs to my apartment. I got stronger emotionally, learning to sit with discomfort instead of immediately trying to fix it, learning that not every problem required me to solve it, learning that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is absolutely nothing. And I got ready for what came next, because I knew there would be one more test, one more moment where he'd try to pull me back into the old pattern, the old dynamic, the old version of me that was easier to control. I just didn't know when it would come. The test came in late spring, almost 2 years after he'd thrown those divorce papers at me. I'd been living in my apartment for over a year, building my new life piece by piece. I was working part-time at an alterations shop. Turned out those sewing skills from my mother's machine were marketable. I was making friends in my building. I was planning my eventual move to the beach. I was healing. Then I got a call from my son. "Dad's sick," he said. "He's in the hospital, heart problems. The doctors say it's serious." My first instinct, the one that had been trained into me over decades, was to ask what he needed, what I could do, when I should come. But I caught myself, took a breath, said, "I'm sorry to hear that. I hope he recovers." My son was quiet for a second. Then he said, "Mom, aren't you going to visit him?" I said, "No, but he's sick. He's asking for you. I'm sure he is, but I'm not going." My son got angry then. Said I was being cold, cruel, unforgiving. Said that whatever happened between us, Dad was still my husband, still family, still deserving of compassion. Said I'd regret it if he died and I hadn't gone. I let him say all of it. Didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't explain. When he was done, I said, "I understand you're upset, but my answer is no. I'm not going." He hung up on me. I sat in my apartment staring at my phone, and I felt the old pull, the old programming trying to activate. The voice saying you're a bad person, you're heartless, you're failing at being a good ex-wife, a good mother, a good Christian woman. The voice saying real love means showing up even when it's hard, even when you don't want to, even when the person hurt you. But underneath that voice was a newer one, stronger now, saying, you don't owe him your presence. You don't owe him your caretaking. You don't owe him the opportunity to manipulate you one more time. I called Patricia, told her what happened. She said, "Good for you. You held your boundary. But what if he actually dies? What if my kids hate me forever?" She said, "Then he dies, and your kids work through their feelings like adults. But you choosing yourself for once doesn't make you responsible for other people's inability to accept your choice." I called my sister-in-law next. She was even more direct. She said, "He's playing his final card. He's using his illness to try to get you back under his control. Don't fall for it. If he was actually dying, they'd be calling other family members too. But he's specifically asking for you because he thinks this is the one thing you won't be able to refuse." She was right. Over the next week, I found out from my daughter, who was keeping me updated without pressure, that he was recovering fine. It had been a scare, not a crisis. He'd be home in a few days. But he'd specifically told my son to call me, had asked multiple times if I'd visited, had apparently crafted this whole narrative about wanting to make peace before it was too late. It was a test, a manipulation. One last attempt to see if the old buttons still worked, if the old programming was still installed, if I could still be guilted into serving him. And I'd passed. I'd said no. I'd held the boundary. I'd chosen myself even when it was hard, even when my kids were disappointed, even when I felt the weight of 36 years of conditioning trying to pull me back. That's when the justice part really hit me. Not legal justice, not external vindication, but internal justice. The kind where you finally see someone clearly for who they've always been, and you realize their opinion of you doesn't matter anymore, where their family's opinion doesn't matter, where the whole web of people who supported or enabled or minimized the abuse, their opinions become irrelevant. My kids were split. My son was furious with me for months. My daughter understood but worried I was being too harsh, too unforgiving. Other family members called to tell me I was making a mistake, that I was being bitter, that I needed to let go of the past. But here's what they didn't understand. I had let go of the past. That's exactly why I wasn't going back. Letting go meant releasing my attachment to their approval, their understanding, their validation. It meant accepting that some people would always believe his version, would always see me as the villain, would always think I should have tried harder, forgiven more, loved better. And it was okay. Their belief in his innocence didn't make me guilty. Their inability to see the truth didn't make it less true. Their comfort with the old family system didn't obligate me to participate in it. I built a new family instead. The women in my building became my sisters. Patricia became like a mother to me, showing me what healthy support looked like. My daughter came around fully once she saw I wasn't just surviving, but thriving. The choir became my foundation. The alteration shop became my purpose. I had people in my life now who showed up without being asked, who checked on me because they cared, not because they needed something, who celebrated my wins and held space for my struggles without making it about them. That's what family was supposed to be. About 6 months after the hospital incident, I was working in the alteration shop when a woman came in. She was probably in her mid-40s, nicely dressed, but with that exhausted look I recognized, the look of someone who's been performing okay for so long they've forgotten what actual okay feels like. She needed a dress hemmed for some work event. While I was pinning the hem, she got a phone call. I tried not to listen, but I couldn't help overhearing. It was clearly her husband, and he was angry about something. She kept apologizing, explaining, justifying. When she hung up, she looked embarrassed. I said, "You don't have to explain," she said. "He's just stressed about work." I forgot to pick up his dry cleaning. I kept pinning, stayed quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Can I ask you something? How often do you find yourself apologizing for things that aren't actually your fault?" She looked at me like I'd seen straight through her. Her eyes filled with tears. She said, "All the time." I nodded, finished the hem. Then I said, "I was married for 36 years to a man who convinced me that everything was my fault, that if I just tried harder, loved better, sacrificed more, things would be okay. It took me until I was 55 to realize that trying harder just gave him more material to work with." We talked for an hour. I told her parts of my story, not to trauma dump, but to let her know she wasn't alone, that what she was feeling had a name, that there was a way out if she ever decided she wanted it. I gave her Patricia's number and told her that if she ever needed to talk to someone who'd been through it, to call. She left with her dress and with something else, permission, maybe, to trust herself, to consider that her constant apologizing might not be a personality flaw, but a survival mechanism, to imagine that there might be a different way to live. I never saw her again. Don't know if she called Patricia, or if she stayed, or if she left. But I planted a seed, and that mattered. That was its own kind of justice, breaking the silence, naming the abuse, refusing to let the next generation of women suffer in isolation the way I had. That's when I really understood what rebirth meant. It wasn't just about me getting free. It was about using my freedom to help others find theirs. It was about taking what I'd learned and paying it forward, creating a ripple effect, making sure my suffering produced something meaningful. I started going to a support group for older women leaving abusive marriages. At first I just listened, but eventually I started sharing. Other women thanked me for putting words to things they'd felt but couldn't name. I got phone numbers pressed into my hand after meetings, whispered requests to talk more, desperate questions about how I did it, how I survived, how I kept going. I told them the truth, one day at a time, one boundary at a time, one small choice for yourself at a time. It's not dramatic. It's not a movie moment. It's slow, hard work to undo decades of conditioning. But it's possible. And you're worth it. The alteration shop became a kind of ministry. Women would come in to get something fixed, and we'd end up talking about marriages that needed fixing, about boundaries that needed mending, about lives that needed altering. The owner, another divorced woman, said she'd hired me because she could tell I understood what women carried, what they needed space to say out loud. I was building something new, not replacing what I'd lost, but creating something different, something better. A life based on authenticity instead of performance, on connection instead of obligation, on mutual respect instead of one-sided sacrifice. And I kept saving, kept planning, kept dreaming about that beach town where I'd eventually land. The money part was hard. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. Living on Social Security and part-time alterations work meant I had to be careful, strategic, patient. But I was learning things I should have learned decades ago about how to protect yourself financially, how to build credit, how to plan for a future that was actually yours. My sister-in-law helped me understand retirement accounts and asset protection. Patricia showed me how to budget for pleasure, not just survival, how to build in small joys instead of always deferring them for someday. My daughter helped me set up automatic savings so I wouldn't be tempted to skip weeks. I watched my little account grow, dollar by dollar, week by week. It wasn't impressive by most standards. I wasn't building wealth or securing a fortune. But I was building security, independence, proof that I could take care of myself. And every time I made a deposit, every time I checked my balance and saw it slowly climbing, I felt a little more powerful, a little more capable, a little less like the woman who'd stood in her kitchen with divorce papers at her feet and no idea how she'd survive. I thought a lot about that Genesis G90 during this time. That bronze luxury car I'd seen him driving once, the one that cost more than I'd make in 5 years of alterations work. He'd bought it shortly after the divorce, probably with money that should have been divided. It was such a perfect symbol of who he was, all flash and status, all about appearing successful, all about having expensive things to fill the empty space where substance should have been. I didn't want a Genesis G90. I didn't even want a car, but I wanted what that car represented. Freedom to go wherever you wanted, luxury that came from your own work, the feeling of being in the driver's seat of your own life. So I kept that image in my mind, not as something to envy, but as something to work toward in my own way. My version wouldn't be a fancy car. It would be a small apartment near the beach, a life that felt spacious and calm, mornings where I could walk by the ocean and evenings where I could watch the sunset without anyone demanding anything from me. That was my luxury. That was my freedom. And it was coming. It's been almost 16 years since those divorce papers landed at my feet. I'm 71 now, and I'm sitting in my little apartment near the beach in a town in Delaware that most people have never heard of. I moved here 2 years ago after spending 14 years building up enough security to make it possible. My apartment is tiny, smaller than the one in Queens, but it's mine. I can see the ocean from my bedroom window if I crane my neck just right. I can hear waves at night when the wind is right. I can walk to the beach in 10 minutes, and I do, almost every day, even in winter. The Singer sewing machine is set up in the corner, and I still use it. I do alterations for a few local shops, enough to supplement my income, enough to keep my hands busy and my mind engaged. But mostly, I do what I want now. I read, I walk. I sit on my tiny balcony and watch the sky change colors. My daughter visits every few months with her kids. My son and I don't talk much. He's still processing, still working through his own feelings about the divorce, about me, about his father. I hope someday we'll find our way back to each other, but if we don't, I've learned to live with that too. I'm in a book club with other women my age. We meet every Tuesday evening, and we talk about books, but also about life, about survival, about what it means to claim yourself after decades of giving yourself away. Most of us are divorced or widowed. Most of us are rebuilding. Most of us are learning that 70 isn't too old to start over. I think about the woman who came into the alteration shop that day, the one who was apologizing for her husband's dry cleaning. I wonder sometimes if she got out, if she called Patricia, if she found her own version of freedom. I hope so. I pray so. Because nobody should live the way I lived for 36 years. And if my story can prevent even one person from losing that much time, it was worth surviving. The legal stuff never really resolved. He kept everything, the house, the accounts, the inheritance money. The family mostly sided with him. I got some child support for a while until the kids were grown, but nothing close to what was actually taken from me. No financial justice, no vindication, no moment where he admitted what he'd done or the family recognized the truth. But I got something more valuable. I got myself back. I got silence that feels like peace instead of punishment. I got mornings where I don't wake up anxious. I got a life that belongs to me. The education piece, the lesson I want to share with anyone listening is this. Protect yourself financially from day one. I don't care how much you love someone or how sure you are that they'd never hurt you. Keep your own account. Know your own credit score. Have access to all financial documents. Don't sign anything without reading it completely. Don't let love or trust become an excuse for ignorance. And here's what most people don't know. According to American statistics, about 4 million seniors are victimized every year. 4 million of us, mostly women, who discover too late that the people we trusted have been exploiting us financially, emotionally, psychologically. We're told to forgive, to keep the peace, to not make waves. We're told that family is everything, that blood is thicker than water, that you should never give up on marriage. But here's what I learned. Sometimes the most radical act of love is walking away. Sometimes protecting yourself is the only way to survive. Sometimes the family you're born into isn't the one that deserves you, and you have to build a new one from scratch. Studies calculate that the consequences of childhood trauma cost $14 trillion per year. $14 trillion. That's the price we all pay when we don't teach children about healthy relationships, when we don't model boundaries, when we normalize sacrifice and minimize abuse. That's the economic weight of what gets passed down generation to generation until someone breaks the cycle. I broke the cycle. It took me until 55 to start, until 57 to really commit, until 71 to feel fully free. But I did it. And if you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in my story, you can do it too. It won't be easy. People will judge you. Family will be disappointed. You'll have moments where you doubt yourself, where you wonder if you're making a mistake, where the old programming tries to pull you back. But on the other side of all that difficulty is a version of yourself you've forgotten existed, or maybe never knew. And she's worth fighting for. Spring is here again. The windows are open and life feels possible. I'm wearing my burgundy sweater, the same one my daughter gave me all those years ago, though I've had to mend it several times now. It's threadbare in places, but I can't let it go. It reminds me of who I was when this all started, when I was still figuring out whether I had the strength to survive. I made collard greens yesterday. Not for anyone else, just for me, because I wanted them. They tasted different than they used to, better somehow. Or maybe I just taste things differently now that I'm not seasoning them with resentment and obligation. My choir robe hangs in the closet here too. I found a church near the beach and joined their choir. We're smaller than the one in Queens, but we sing with the same spirit. The women here welcomed me without questions, without needing to know my whole story. They just knew I could sing, and I showed up, and that was enough. That's the final destination I was looking for. Not a physical place, though this beach town is perfect, but a mental and emotional space where showing up as myself is enough. Where I don't have to perform or prove or justify my existence, where I can just be. I think about that moment sometimes, standing in my kitchen with those divorce papers at my feet, that pot of collard greens still simmering, my life as I knew it ending right there in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. I think about that smile that confused him so much, that smile that came from somewhere I didn't even know existed. I understand it now. I was smiling because I was finally seeing the truth, and the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than the lie. I was smiling because he thought he was taking everything, but he couldn't take the parts of me I'd hidden away to protect them. He couldn't take my mother's sewing machine, or my voice in the choir, or my ability to love authentically, or my capacity to start over. He could take the money in the house and the family's support, but he couldn't take me. Not the real me, the essential me, the me that had been waiting underneath all that sacrifice and silence for permission to exist again. And once I understood that, once I really knew it in my bones, the rest became possible. The leaving became possible. The surviving became possible. The rebuilding became possible. The thriving became possible. So if you're reading this and you're in that kitchen right now, standing there with your own version of divorce papers or whatever form your breaking point takes, know this: the smile is real. The possibility is real. The other side of all this pain is real. You just have to be willing to walk through the fire to get there. And if you're reading this and you recognize someone you love in this story, a mother, a sister, a friend who's been getting smaller and quieter and more exhausted, please say something. Don't wait for her to figure it out on her own. Don't assume she knows she's being abused. Don't think it's not your place to interfere. Plant the seed. Ask the question. Be the person who sees her when she can't see herself. Because I promise you, she's in there. The woman she used to be. The woman she could still become. She's in there somewhere, waiting for one person to believe in her enough to help her remember who she is. Have you lived this? Do you know someone who has? If this story touched you, if it helped you see something you needed to see, please share it, like it, subscribe. Not for me, but for the next person who needs to hear these words. For the woman sitting in her kitchen right now wondering if she's crazy. For the man trying to figure out why his mother seems so sad. For the daughter watching her mom disappear and not knowing how to help. These stories save lives. Your engagement helps them reach the people who need saving. So if you got something from this, pass it on. And if you're the one who needs saving, know that you're not alone. You're not crazy. You're not too old. You're not too far gone. You're just exactly where I was, and I made it out, which means you can too. The ocean is calling. I'm going to walk down to the beach and watch the sunset, something I do most evenings now. It never gets old. Seeing the sky turn those impossible colors, watching the water shimmer with reflected light, feeling the sand under my feet, and knowing I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. I made it, and you will too.